Commonly regarded as the cheapest way to get into PC gaming, you grab yourself a cheap SFF PC such as a 1155 Compaq or Optiplex, stick a cheap low-powered graphics card in it, and end up spending £50 or dollars on a gaming PC. But today in 2018, how well does this tactic actually work? This right here is the HP Compaq 8200 from 2011, a mid-range pre-built which made its way all across the world, being commonplace in many offices who are upgrading from older Core 2 Duo or Quad machines. They offered very quick performance while using lower power and relatively cool at the same time. They were essentially the types of PCs that were found anywhere that had the money to upgrade when they released, given the fact that most people were leaping at the chance to get their hands on a Sandy Bridge or Ivy Bridge machine, given the massive performance increase. Dell, HP and Acer and all other various OEMs made their own types of SFF PCs very similar to this, and in fact I actually ordered an Optiplex originally but my order got cancelled, so I just bought this cheap HP, as it doesn't matter what you're going for, these things are literally everywhere. However, I'd argue that the Acer ones are actually the best, given that they are much less proprietary than the Dell or HP variants. So what actually are these base specifications of this HP, you ask? Well, it includes a Core i3-2120, 2GB of DDR3 RAM, and a low wattage proprietary power supply unit, as well as being powered by the Intel HD 2000 graphics chip, which has a 250GB Seagate 7200rpm HDD present for storage. However, these types of PCs came with all similar specifications, so you might get a Core i5 in one, a Core i3 in another. Realistically, they will all have the same socket and will all be a similar price. However, generally the Core i3s and the Pentium ones are the most common ones you'll find around this mark. You can grab these off eBay from a reseller or even from an education surplus shop, as we all know they're very much dirt cheap these days. And as of a couple of years ago, they were in fact the best way to get into PC gaming on the cheap. So there is our base model, and what exactly are we going to do to make this a gaming PC? Well, considering this is budget builds, we don't exactly have much of a budget left, so our budget stretches to £20 more, bringing us up to a £50 total, or roundabouts that mark, which is achievable by most people on a budget. I bought as a fairly standard SFF GPU pairing with the AMD Radeon R9 255, which is about the same as an R7 250 or HD 7750. Alternatively, a GT 740 would also be about the same power-wise, so generally these things are quite low-powered and very much common in most markets actually. It has 2GB of DDR3 VRAM, which is the main issue with the card. However, as you can see, it's an ideal pairing given its cheap price in 2018, and realistically the fact that you don't really want to spend much more than £50 if you're buying a budget PC like this. And the performance with the Core i3 is quite matching given the price of the cards we're looking at. But generally, no matter what one of these cards you go for, you'll see pretty much the same performance. While we continue to clean this thing up a little bit, let's talk a little bit about what we're doing to this thing PC-wise. As CPU-wise, we're going to keep the i3 in there, as these things are pretty decent considering the budget we're working with, and I'll likely be investigating the CPU to its full potential very soon to see how good it is actually in 2018 when paired with a top-end graphics card. And lastly, I just stuck in 6GB more RAM to bring us up to that healthy 8GB of RAM in total, which I just bought off eBay. I mean, you can get this stuff off CEX or eBay or AliExpress. DDR3 RAM hasn't actually been affected as much as DDR4 from my findings, so no matter where you are in the world, you should be able to find some for a decent price, making a build like this even more compelling. Of course, DDR3 hasn't changed too much in price compared to DDR4, which is my main reason for saying that. You will want to keep in mind that the wattage on the PCIe lane can change per model, but generally, unless you're buying an extremely locked down system, you don't really need to worry about this too much. Just take a look at your model name on Google, and chances are you'll see people being able to fit graphics cards if you type in added graphics card on the end of that Google search. I mean, that's what I did with this HP, and people are stucking in things like a HD 8490 in it and it was working fine. Of course, the R9 255 consumes more power than that, but realistically, I'm not too worried that it won't work. Generally, if you don't need a 6-pin connector, you won't need to worry. However, do keep in mind that Googling your model number can verify this for you. You should pretty much expect to clean out any of these things as they're generally pretty old, so they do have 5 to 6 years worth of dust inside, and they just need 10 minutes of cleaning and some new thermal paste to get them properly tidy. Feel free to take a scrubbing brush to any of those dirt-filled heat sinks, but mostly just grab yourself a brush and get it all over with once. They come apart relatively easily, and they're all pretty nicely designed, especially these HPs, with that little funnel acting as an outtake for all the hot air, so they are pretty quiet as well. Their small size makes them very easy to place down, and in all honesty is making me regret not going for mini ITX for my main PC. But then again, I need my PC for a lot more than gaming, and these little things are purely for gaming alone, and they don't need to contain tons of hard drives and being used with multiple graphics cards and stuff like that. But anyway, enough with the talking. Let's see how these things perform once they're straight back together. So after hooking this thing up, we did have to swap around the graphics card to the second PCIe slot, as for some reason the other one wouldn't give us any display outputs. I did decide to put Windows 10 on here, as the latest games do actually require DirectX 12 to work, which unfortunately we can't use on Windows 7, otherwise I'd actually be using that, seeing as that's my favourite operating system to actually use. But anyway, let's see if the cheapest way to get into PC gaming still holds up well in the benchmarks. General usage worked perfectly fine, as these things were designed to work in an office, so not working in a place like this would be pretty awful. The upgraded graphics card and RAM do help the PC a bit, but it would work fine just by itself even with integrated graphics and the original 2 gigs of RAM. However, that is a little bit short 2 gigs, so it's a nice thing we've got 8 in here. Although however great it is in the actual desktop doesn't exactly translate into gaming performance, as we've seen before. So why don't we see how this thing holds up in some real gaming. First up we have PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, which is going to be one of the harder games to run as expected. We saw 35 FPS on average with 900p and the low settings, which to my eyes was pretty damn playable for essentially a £50 computer. It was better than the Xbox One version of the game for sure, and really the CPU and GPU together are holding us back, but they pair up quite nicely, as the game does require 4 threads and luckily i3 does provide them, admittedly a little bit weaker than the ones it would like. However, with 26 FPS 1% lows and 0.1% lows of 14 FPS, we could see that it did struggle during the actual playing down. But the CPU and GPU were very balanced and I saw no issues with how the game was running. Do keep in mind that these were some decent enough settings and I was fully able to play a match and even get a couple of kills with these settings. Fortnite, which has lately been surpassing PUBG in popularity, ran great with 43 FPS on average throughout our entire time playing, with the 900p resolution and the low and medium settings used, which made the game look pretty fine while it was running, as I like to get a nice balance between graphical fidelity and frame rate, which of course makes it much easier to play in my opinion. Of course Fortnite is way more optimised than the likes of the aforementioned PUBG, and I was still able to completely play that fine, so this was absolutely okay. Of course the game didn't slow down too much at all aside from the initial approach, and even in action as you can see the game ran completely fine. As for the likes of CSGO, a game that I was sort of debating between benchmarking, but then remembered that this game is a lot more bloated, so it makes sense to give it a test on a system like this in 2018. So running with most of the settings set to low aside from shadows on high in the 1080p resolution, returns with a very playable and very pleasant 99 FPS on average, which is way more than playable for most games, and is pretty decent for competitive play in CSGO. But then again, if you want hundreds of FPS, then you should probably get a better PC than this. However, from my time playing, I found it completely fine, and the game's performance was brilliant, so the main way I was playing bad was purely probably because of myself, so I can't blame that on the PC. GTA 5 is still one of the most popular games on Steam, so I did decide to give it a little test out there to see how it handles those sort of open world games on a system like this. And it ran very similarly to an SFF PC I built a little while ago, which was of course a little bit less powerful but was also cheaper. And this was very similar, with high settings in 900p bringing us a 32 FPS average, with 1% lows down to 19 FPS and 0.1% lows bringing us down to 16 FPS at the very worst of times. Looking great and running very similarly to that of an Xbox One or PS4 console, the R9 255 did struggle occasionally, likely due to that DDR3 VRAM compared to our usual GDDR5 we see on most cards, however still very playable. Fallout 4 ran fine with a mixture of low and medium settings for a return of 31 FPS on average. It looked better than the console variants of the game in some aspects and would even hit slightly higher results when you were inside a building or were travelling around the wastes. The game could even see higher results if we had a better GPU, as the CPU wasn't struggling too badly even in the most intense parts of the city, so definitely playable on a system like this. Once again, before the comments section is flooded with about 500 comments saying can it run Crysis, it can in fact run Crysis nicely in the 900p resolution with medium and high settings selected, which looked great and ran perfectly fine at a stable frame rate of 34 FPS on average, which is decent considering how taxing the game can be on a system like this. The dual-core nature of the i3 didn't seem to struggle either, and the graphics card holds up remarkably well in quite a demanding title. But so far we've only really tried games that have taxed the GPU to the max. What happens when we push that i3 to the limits? Well, I tried out City Skylines, which I just tried with a little city so far, as we do know that the larger cities are guaranteed to struggle, but even so we saw 36 FPS on average, which was perfectly playable in a slower paced game like this. Medium settings looked fine and the 900p resolution didn't exactly make things bad on the system either. These things always prove taxing in the late game, so do expect slowdown on both the CPU and GPU as your city becomes larger, but for the most part these smaller cities should perform absolutely fine. Minecraft is a game that people will always end up playing at some point, so with some nice shaders in the 1080p resolution and some fancy settings, we saw a playable 33 FPS on average with some decent frame times to boot, including a couple of drops when the world was actually loading in. But that happens on most PCs, so I was going to say the game is pretty damn smooth for the most part. You could however just completely remove the shaders and you'll see a solid 60 plus FPS, but personally I do quite enjoy the shaders, so I decided to keep them in for this benchmark. Wolfenstein 2 is our final test out there as it uses the Vulkan renderer, but even with the lowest settings in 480p it just wasn't smooth enough, it just didn't feel right. And I mean sort of the FPS on average shows that, but really it's down to our weaker GPU, and it just met its match in a game like this as it's very demanding. The CPU is only seeing around 20% in usage because of this and the frame times were all over the place, but generally this doesn't even look remotely playable. So although the end of our final gaming tests, I did decide to test recording capabilities with a machine like this. So here was a quick 1080p recording done with AMD's Relive software, which is included with the drivers on the graphics card. It uses the onboard AMD VCE encoder, which I've already found superior to Nvidia's NVENC and Intel's QuickSync. In fact, it's actually quite close to software encoding for most things, aside from streaming, in which case you should always use this, but I've actually got away with streaming on VCE before, back when an i3 was my full chip. So yes, you can actually use VCE for streaming at lower bit rates, although for recording we saw this perfectly clear Skyrim gameplay clip, which was recorded in 1080p with the high settings. The FPS test is of course without recording, but we didn't seem to lose any FPS from the recording as you can see. So 44 FPS on average was definitely playable for Skyrim, the game looked great and the recording did look decent, so yes, you can record on a machine like this. Synthetically, for all of you that enjoy benchmarks, we have the 3D Mark Firestrike test, which of course we saw score 1640, placing our CPU and GPU combo around that of the GTX 465 machine I did a while ago, essentially showing us that this little chip can provide the power of an old Fermi chip while consuming way less power, which is understandably amazing considering the benchmarks we saw on that GPU. In Time Spy, the architecture did help out a tad with the card scoring 561, which isn't actually too far from the GTX 480 we just reviewed. It's admittedly not a great score, but also goes to show that a little system like this can handle some DirectX 12 gaming if we needed it to. The likes of emulation is also fine, with Super Mario Galaxy 2, one of the most intensive Wii games, running on the machine, which could suffer some slowdown when playing at higher resolutions, but for the most part, as you can see in this recording, is absolutely fine with a few graphical enhancements. The likes of Wind Waker or Wii Sports would be absolutely fine in the HD settings without the fear of any slowdown, which means this is actually quite a nice little emulation box considering the form factor of the machine and the performance we're getting emulation-wise. So in conclusion, I came into this video thinking that it was time to retire the Core i3 SFF builds and move on to new pastures with the Core i5 minimums and the likes of an RX 550 or GT 1030 as a minimum GPU to stick in it. But in all honesty, I'm pleasantly surprised. It proved that for around £50 you can build a PC by just picking up one of these on an eBay auction or at a local warehouse, sticking in whatever decent low-power GPU you can find, as well as a little bit more RAM, and you're good to go. You've got into PC gaming. It's a little gaming machine, and that's all it needs to do. Run games decently at decent settings, and they have to be playable, which all the games were. I had no issues using this machine for an entire day, and it was just lovely. It's cheap, it's simple, it's available. It's everything you need in a cheap gaming PC. So if you're in the need for one of these cheap PCs, then why not go out and get one? They are absolutely everywhere. I honestly thought it was time to say goodbye and move on up with the power and the cost. But for some decent little gaming performance, yes, you can get away with it on one of these little SFF computers. Thank you very much for watching. Good night. Thank you very much for watching. I hope those of you looking to grab these PCs are able to, and you can always like and subscribe for more content like this, and I hope to catch you all in another tech video.